Welcome back for all the people who went to Paris last week. So this week we have Ken Hinckley from Microsoft Research. Ken does a lot of really cool creative stuff involving pens, touchscreens, paper, mobile devices, and combining all of them to support creative tasks. He's also survived having me as an intern, so he deserves an award for that. So yeah, I'll just let Ken get started. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks, Morgan. It's good to be here. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, Morgan was a handful. He was the hardest student I ever had to manage. He just left him alone in the room and great stuff happened. So, oh crap, I got a typo on my first slide already. I can't believe it. My name is spelled wrong. Fortunately, with the pen, I can correct that. So, people at Microsoft do call me Ken Hinckley, Pen Hinckley sometimes. It's like, so as people in this room are probably well aware, we're kind of in the midst of this gigantic shift to direct input, which is well in hand at this point. And we're seeing this across all variety of form factors, from handheld slates, drafting board style computers, tabletops, and on up to wall displays. And a lot of the focus on existing devices have been around what you can do with touch on them, but pen can also play a role in all these form factors, because of course the pen is also another way to input directly on the screen. And so I'll be talking a little bit about sort of making a case for that, as well as how it combines with touch. So of course everyone asks me, well, what is in the future about touch? Why should we care about pen? And I always like to bring along my nemesis from Microsoft to help me with this part. It's this guy named Mr. I Am a Big Body. He doesn't actually work at Microsoft. He's a corporate denizen of Third Rate Incorporated. And he likes to bug me during my talks, kind of ask the rude Q&A. And he says, I can type faster than I can write, so why do I need a pen? And my response to him is, well, what is it that you wish to write? A keyboard is an equally bad device for typing something on a Post-it note, because you're not going to go to your text buffer and type that in and print it out and put it on a sticky. It's just the act of just jotting that quick note down is where the virtue is there. And of course, when you're done, you can stick it to something else, like your monitor or the document that you're trying to make a note about. Or another example is, try typing something like this. If you're Darwin drawing the tree of life, that doesn't translate too well to a keyboard. It's the spatial arrangement of the strokes is what matters. Or maybe you're a big wig signing off on the checks. The president signature looks good with pen. Or maybe just for sort of more human expression, you could type exactly the same words in your text buffer, and it will not have the same emotional impact as something like this. Of course, there's things like highlighting, where you can sort of blaze your own trail through text. You can mark out the passages that are important to you in a very quick way while you're reading. And in fact, you can go further with this and kind of use it as a way to informally identify and loosely categorize content. And even do things like, people will rotate the pen to get different line weights and so forth, to sort of say, well, this is really important, this is somewhat important. Maybe like pink versus blue is a different category in terms of how you think about things. And there's even some people who go into the student bookstore and they'll seek out the used text so they can find the ones that are like this. So as long as you get a good student, that can help you with figuring out what to study. And of course, there's cases like this where you're intermingling sketches and notes. I spent 5 years in a neurosurgery department in grad school, so I like this, sort of revisiting the circle of Willis was good to review my neuroanatomy. But this is the kind of thing where, often in educational context, as well as in, professional design, those kind of things, people are doing tasks like this all the time, and it's just, you can't do this with normal text entry and keyboards. And even just going, stepping beyond what you do on the pages themselves have a lot of virtue. If you look at what people are doing when they're navigating through a notebook or a textbook that they're referring to frequently, you'll see these very, very complex behaviors where, like in this picture, for example, the person's looking for something in their notes. They've got their fingers are saving a page here. They've got a page bookmarked with their finger here. There's another page they can access instantly here, and the pen is right at hand. And so these kind of behaviors are, with paper text, we don't even think about these. These are just things we do naturally in the background. You can scan through hundreds of pages, access content very rapidly this way. But if you try to do this on like a Kindle reader, for example, it's just clear how far we have to go with supporting these kind of behaviors as well. And these kind of go hand in hand with the use of the pen. My favorite example is, annotating documents probably. This is another great one because all the information here is in terms of how the marks lie on top of the content. So first of all, compared to kind of the markup features you might see in Word or something, The marks are very distinct from the text, so it's immediately clear what is the annotation and what is being annotated, so there's a figure ground separation. And as well, there's sort of this, you can have like little stars or personal iconography, which, even if the machine recognized it, it might not mean what it means to you. So even if you threw all this at a handwriting recognizer, you get one word out of it, which is how. So the spatial relationship of the marks to the content is where the value is here. And again, you can, sort of these marginalia, have questions to yourself, all those kind of behaviors. Of course, what it often really boils down to is, this is sort of the napkin sketch, and it is a cliche, but it's one that I like, because you just can't type this whole of a new idea. This whole act of sketching something out in the paper napkin is sort of a great way to just capture thoughts quickly and get the essence of an idea, rather than being distracted by the details of bulleted lists and slides and so forth. But even with that, it's not all about the pen, because if you're going to do the napkin sketch, first you need a napkin. You're not going to go grab the napkin with your pen, which seems silly in the real world, but when we talk about tablets and laptops and so forth that have pen input, that's often exactly what people are asked to do, is use one device for everything. In the real world, we don't do that, and I'll be returning to that point. Okay, so Mr. Big Body's getting annoyed with me still. He says, all right, just tell me which is best, the touch or the pen. And on this, I'd like to steal a riff from Bill Buxton, who's one of my colleagues at Microsoft. And he likes to say that everything, including touch, is best for something and worse for something else. So you don't really understand a modality like touch or pen, or even a particular device like a handheld versus the large display, unless you understand what's great about it and also what's terrible about it, or what it's not appropriate for, and understand why and in what context and for what users. So that's really what it boils down to. All right, so I mentioned reading. So what about reading then? This is something it's really at the core of a lot of professional work, as well as the activities that students engage in. Reading is often sort of at the core of the workflow. And in fact, there's many people who have gone out and sort of studied, like for knowledge workers, for example, they'll just sort of do these diary studies of what were you doing during your day. And for certain types of work, often between 75 to 90% of what the person's doing is in some way touching paper documents and reading and writing while they're doing that. So of course, as Steve Jobs once said, nobody actually reads anymore, do they? Well, in fact, they do. There's this thing called the Kindle that's happened now. And in fact, there's this whole new world of publishing where it's, it's kind of this golden age of fiction all over again. And there's, something that, this is a new anthology magazine that's out these days. And the guy who publishes this, he had a publishing company in the 1990s where they published around 250 books, and it took them 30 people in 9 years to do that. And they've done the same thing in this new world of publishing in 3 years now, without bankrupting themselves. So it's a completely new world in terms of getting content out there to people as well. And of course, when you go beyond sort of the recreational reading and into the more of these active reading type of tasks, there's been a lot of these examples where Amazon has deployed the Kindle at various colleges and universities. And the feedback often comes back something like this, where, yeah, it's great not to have 40 pounds of bags in my backpack, but I can't thumb through the pages, I can't highlight things, I can't mark things up. And this kind of feedback came up over and over again. I think actually this study was done at UW at some point on the Kindle DX. So it gets back to that point where these devices they're really promising, but they still aren't supporting these active reading behaviors effectively. And there's a great book by Abby Sellin, if you want to read more about this, where she's kind of, the work it's actually about 10 years old now, but it's still spot on in terms of the actual things that people do when they're doing sort of engaged in these deep learning and deep creative work kind of tasks. And she's just done these great studies of just illustrating what the behaviors are. So I highly recommend this book. And so, just getting down to it, people kind of, when they think of reading, they still often think of this, well, I just read linear content and that's all there is to reading. But when you start unpacking it and looking at, through these studies that Abby and others have done, what the actual behaviors are, there's sort of all these various continents of behaviors start peeling off here, where it's not just reading content, but I'm writing, I'm organizing things, I'm cross-referencing between documents, I have multiple documents open, I'm collecting new things that I need to read, and all these behaviors feed into the actual work that people are doing. And again, you can get into a deeper level and say, well, writing is I'm sketching, I might be doodling, I might have marginalia, all these examples I've been showing, and you can kind of do this for all of these behaviors. So when you get down to it, there's, reading is actually this very complex set of behaviors, and supporting them effectively with technology is still, I would say, largely an open challenge that needs a lot more work. And so I'm trying to just attack little pieces of this here and there, but it's still wide open for innovation in the commercial world as well. So I guess my point here is that reading as this consumption activity that's really a myth. When you look at what people actually do with content, it's inseparable from the annotation and creation of new artifacts of work. Okay, so what? But isn't touch a more natural user interface? People like to throw this term around these days, where it's a NUI or natural user interface. And I like to refer to this as the Nutella model of interaction design. People have this thought of like, oh, if I just get touch and I put it on my screen, that'll make it, my UI, that'll make it better. So it's kind of like just spreading chocolate over things, just naturally improves it. And so I call this the Nutella interface design approach. And of course, it doesn't work out that way in practice. And I think the pen has an important role to play here because it's a tool that expresses and amplifies thought. And it's also a precision instrument that lends itself to these more creation-oriented activities. And as a distinct tool from touch, it can reduce the friction in the interface and open up new possibilities for new interactions and tools. Another way of saying this is there's another great book by Richard Florida called The Rise of the Creative Class, where he studies how all these people are coming up in the world and doing all these great things. And he has this quote in there that I really love, where he says, "The winners in the long run are those who can create and keep creating." So we need, in my opinion, if we're going to make the most out of these tablets and these new mobile devices, we need to support these kind of activities effectively. And I think the pen is part of the answer there. So, do we want to educate these virtuosos and scientists and creative professionals of the future, or we just want to lather more chocolate on things? So I don't know, who votes for chocolate? Anybody? Okay, so Mr. Big Body, not this guy again. He says, I don't care if the pen has failed, and if you see a stylus, they blew it, right? And I'd have to say, mea culpa here to some extent. So I want to go into a very detailed analysis of why the pen has failed, just slightly abridged version here. And it basically boils down to this, where in current interfaces, writing with the pen is still a lot like writing with a brick. There's in terms of the actual technologies that we're using, the lag and the feel of the pen and everything, there's a lot of room for improvement. And furthermore, it's the fact that we've often just focused too much on the pen and by itself, and also the recognition aspect by itself. People kind of come up and they have this attitude like, well, if I could just, if the computer understand what I wrote in this piece of paper, that would solve everything. Well, we've spent, at Microsoft, we've spent 10 years basically attacking that, and it's like, well, no, that's not actually the answer, I don't think. So I think it's more about how it fits together with this ecosystem of devices and these other modalities. So let me back up for a second and talk about come on and have a seat. Talk about this more from the human perspective, hands and handedness. So in some of our work in this area, we kind of backed up. We just said like, okay, let's forget about the technology for a minute. Let's just look what people do with paper and pens and scraps of paper, that kind of thing. So we had this task where we gave them a little paper notebook, and we gave them a bunch of sheets that had just kind of cool pictures and stuff printed on it. And the task was, imagine that you're designing your own short film, and you're going to do a storyboard for your film. And so then people would basically cut out pieces of the paper, they'd note what their idea was, and they sort of just arrange them in the book to just show what their idea for the film was. And then we just recorded all the sessions on video, and we just paid attention to what they did and went back and looked at them later. And these really interesting behaviors emerged. So like one is, as you can see in the top picture, people did this kind of thing a lot where they just tucked the pen between their fingers. This is a behavior we saw over and over again. So even when their hands are kind of busy with their fingers manipulating things, the pen was still often just tucked there so they could just very quickly go back to writing. So in terms of interleaving pen and touch interactions, that's just sort of a natural behavior that we saw all the time. Another is that people tended to hold clippings while they're writing. So maybe this one is the best example of it. With this piece of paper, the person has already glued this down, so they don't need to just hold this just to keep it tacked in place. But it's kind of this, often they do it with 2 fingers, sometimes 1 finger. It was kind of this way to direct their attention to what they were working on, and then they could be writing off to the side. But it was just sort of this inherent thing where when they were working on something, they tended to touch it with their fingers and pin it on the page. Furthermore, I kind of touched on this earlier. Of course, people were not moving scraps of paper around with the pen. And again, it seems obvious in the real world, but it hasn't translated to what we do with our technologies. And I think that's something that needs to change. And of course, people were using 2 hands for stuff all the time, and often, in computers, we're just using 1 hand. And we'd even see some more whimsical behaviors, like there was this one person who they like to grab little pieces of paper and kind of use them as a straight edge to draw straight lines. And again, like sort of these navigational behaviors that I talked about earlier. However, having said all this, the idea is not to design interfaces that exactly do what we do with paper and pens. So I think we can have designs that are evocative of these behaviors, but they don't have to be strictly beholden to those behaviors either. So time for a quick pop quiz. So I want to show of hands. How many people in this room write with their right hand? All right, how many left-handers do we have? Oh, fair sampling. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you guys were smarter. You flunked the exam, because the answer is you actually use both hands when you write. There's a well-known study by a gentleman named Yves Guillard, which was done in mid-1980s. He's a behavioral psychologist, and he came up with this really cool experiment where he basically gave people dictation and had them write down the words. And he snuck a piece of carbon paper under the desk that they were writing on. And so what the carbon paper would record was where the strokes were relative to the desk rather than relative to the sheet of paper. So this is the actual working space that the person was using. So it shows that they had rotated the page this way and they were shifting it up and down as they were writing. So there's kind of this preferred area to work. And so this is what you actually end up with. And so it clearly shows that both hands are involved in the act of doing this transcription. So he was trying to make the point of like, well, no, writing is not a one-handed or unimanual activity. And excuse me, his higher level point was that asking, the reason you flunked the exam is I asked you a misleading question, which is asking which hand is best, the right hand or the left hand, is fundamentally the wrong question to ask. So what you want to ask is, what is the logic of the division of labor between the hands when they're both applied to a task to work in cooperation? And I'd like to apply this thinking also to this question of pen and touch. So it's not which is best, the pen or touch or keyboard or any of these things. It's what is the logic of applying both of them to an interface design at the same time in a way that you can maximize each of them and sort of have them complement each other's strengths and weaknesses. So in terms of the designs that we pursued, the high-level answer we came up with is that the pen writes and touch manipulates. So you can do things like pinch gestures with your fingers, pan things around, and then also have the pen just be dedicated to writing. So that's very straightforward. But immediately that gives you this really tremendous fluidity of just doing these annotation kind of tasks, capturing content, drawing sketches, while you're manipulating, while you're navigating through different parts of the UI, while you're zooming in and out. You can create new objects with your fingers, all those kind of things. And then on top of that, you can combine the pen and touch together to create new tools. And I'll show a video in a second with some specific examples of this. And we did this in a system, we called it manual dexterity. I like terrible puns that are uniquely searchable for names of systems, but they're usually hard to spell. But we did this on actually on the old Microsoft Surface tables. It was kind of not quite as big as this, but it was a horizontal surface. And the reason we did it on that platform was that at the time that was the only direct display where we could do both pen and touch simultaneously. That's actually changing very rapidly. Like, even this laptop I have right here, it has both two-finger touch and pen on it, for example, and this is becoming more and more commonplace. So if I was to do this project again, I would do it on the Surface Pro or something like that, one of the modern devices. So it's a long way of saying that while it's done on this sort of drafting table form factor, don't get too attached to that, because all the interactions we designed, we were thinking all the time translating these to slate-type devices, because we knew that's where things were going. So let me show the video, and I'll try our hackery for the sound. Let's see, there should be sound. Hello. Oh, that's weird. Oh, thank you.
Our pen, as distinct from other multi-touch contacts. By default, the pen writes. I can write while my hand rests on the display. But touch manipulates. For example, I can zoom the page with my non-preferred hand. I can flip between pages. I can move objects around. Or I can quickly grab a post-it, but still write on it at a moment's notice. This has a surprising obviousness to it, but don't miss how pen and touch complement one another. There's a tremendous fluidity with which I can interleave annotation and other secondary tasks. The mode switch is in my hand. Let's take a closer look at how I created that post-it by dragging my finger across the bezel. The novice way of working is that I can slide it out and tap a post-it, then I drag it into place. Once I've done this a couple times, I know how to create a post-it. Now I can just swipe across to create it and drag it into place, all in a single transaction. And when I'm not using the bezel menu, it's just barely there and doesn't interfere with my writing at all. A dual-page view affords exploration of book and page-centric interactions with pen and touch. For example, here I hold my page, much as I would by inserting my finger in a real notebook, to keep my place, rapidly flip back and forth between parts of a document, jot some notes, and return to my original page, all in a quick sequence of interleaved touch-pen-touch interactions. I can pinch across the pages for semantic zooming to my desk view. Here I have an extended workspace that affords a spatial holding pattern for my current work. I can leave notes for myself, switch between documents and other notebooks. Go back to full page view, and so on. Even split the screen views by doing a half pinch. Next, we explored how the expanded input vocabulary afforded by the combination of pen and touch can give new tools. I can copy a photo by holding it and peel off a copy using the pen, just like pulling Silly Putty off of the Sunday comics. I can tap select a number of photos and staple them together by holding one and tapping on it with the pen. That photo becomes the representative one for the entire stack. I can turn my pen into an X-Acto knife by holding a photo and crossing it with the pen. Both the cut and the surround fall onto the work surface, just like they would when cutting real paper. Or if I cross a photo using my other finger instead of the pen, I can tear it in two.
It's useless but fun.
If I hold the photo in place with my thumb and forefinger, I can use it as a straight edge. Many of our techniques can be composed. For example, I can X-Acto cut a photo along a straight edge. I select the photo I want to cut, I hold my straight edge over it, and then I draw along the straight edge across the selected photo. This composition of techniques is possible because tapping provides a way to define a collective scope of more than one object, and because holding phrases together multiple pen and touch inputs into a single chunk that the system can interpret as a unitary command. We have also experimented with using touch as a handle for in-place commands. If I tap the display, it produces a finger shadow. If I ignore the finger shadow, it disappears in a couple of seconds. I can pull on the dot to expand an accordion menu with additional commands. Here, it is natural to use my finger to smear colors on the display. Gradually, I rub all the ink off my finger. I can hold my current pen stroke with my finger to transition to digital tape draw. This allows me to fluidly intermingle freehand sketching, straight lines, and smooth curves, without ever moving my hands away from the locus of interaction. Finally, I can use a photo as a brush effect for the pen. Let's pick a semi-transparent highlighter, as that's a good way to demo this. I hold the photo and brush on the page with the pen. While I continue to hold the source photo, each successive stroke is interpreted as a common set that together map onto the same photo. This simple technique can produce some fun and unique effects. We have seen how pen plus touch input on a direct display affords a design space where the pen writes, touch manipulates, and the combination of pen and touch gives new tools. A number of simple pen or touch actions, such as holding, tapping, dragging, and crossing, can be composed in a phrase structure, delineated by the muscular tension of holding an object or state that affords a very rich design space of interactions. All this can be done without using a button on the pen, or without any permanently visible UI that detracts from the user's focus on the workspace.
All right, so that gives you a sense of some of the interactions we explored there. I guess one other thing I'd like to say about that system is there's quite a few, let me get back in here. There's quite a few gestures that we showed there. And if I was actually going to commercially deploy something like this, I would never put all of those gestures in the system at the same time. So it's kind of the difference between doing a research system versus something that would be a production system. So when I do these research systems, like what I like to do is I kind of like to push a modality just to the point where it starts to break, and I think that's where you learn things. So we're intentionally trying a lot of different options for how things could work, how things could combine. And some of them we tried because, like for example, like tearing the paper in half with the finger. I said that was useless, but But the reason we wanted to try that is we had another gesture that was using the pen to cut with the same motion. We wanted to get a sense of, well, how does that subtle contrast, if you have a different functionality there, does that feel good? Does it feel bad? Do people expect that to do the same thing? It lets you probe those kind of questions. So for kind of exploring and understanding a new modality, I think that kind of approach is really valuable. In terms of the one that people really resonated the most with, I would say it's probably the 3 on the top. Particularly like the ability to peel off the copy is one that a lot of people liked because it's sort of a very natural way you can just pin something, you can peel it off with a pen and create a copy of it. So if you think about this compared to like the traditional cut, copy, paste kind of functionality, it combines all of the selecting the object, executing the copy command, pasting it, and dragging it to its final location is just a single gesture. And people, they didn't say it that way, but when they talked about it, they're like, oh yeah, it just feels like doing one thing. So instead of having this kind of breaking their workflow down into multiple commands, it just feels like one thing. People also really like the ability to stack things quickly with this stapling gesture, and the X-Acto cut was also one that was a lot of fun for people. So I'm gonna go on to the next project. Is there any questions about the pen and touch stuff while I'm kind of at this point?
I was just thinking about the peel off and copy, and it seems like you could do that just with 2 fingers. Did anyone comment about the use of a pen? Like what?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first off, I would say that for the simple behaviors, people they instinctively got that the pen and the touch should do different things. So people weren't expecting that their finger should leave a mark in most cases. There was one example that I showed in the video where, like with these color chips, that was one example where we found that people did expect when they scrubbed their finger on that, they wanted to have the finger do something. So what we did is we just gave it a different look than the pen. And so that you weren't stuck in this mode where your finger just kept writing. Like you notice this thing where I keep rubbing and the ink would sort of go away. That was our kind of clever way to get out of that mode so it would never get stuck on. And also if you did something like if you flip to a new page, it would just automatically turn that mode off. For the combined gestures like the peeling off the copy, people also, they appreciated that the pen could have a different function because you need to also remember that there was I don't think it was shown in the video, but there was a gesture where it could do a 2-finger pinch and that would expand the object. So, and that's not distinguishable from this necessarily from what the system sees or even from what the user's expectations are. So that's why if you try to do everything with multi-touch, you kind of end up with these gestures that look very similar, and then you're trying to make them look different by some kind of widgets or some little mode switch. But just having the pen as a distinct object, people don't even think of that as a mode. They just, once they know that the pen has a different effect, they just instinctively do that. So it's a really nice way to support mode switching in essence without having modes. Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly about this project we did called Inksane. And this was, we actually released this, gosh, it was probably about 6 years ago now. We wanted to do this, you kind of were like, well, these tablet computers are great, but nobody's ever really done something that shows what the pen can be used for in these things in an effective way. So we did a prototype that we deployed publicly that we tried to just rethink sort of the whole UI from the pen perspective. And so it basically supported this really simple workflow where you can write stuff and then it has some great search capabilities built in so you can easily find other content or other documents, books on your device, bring them up for annotation or to clip pieces out of them and put in your notes. And then it had some great tools for gathering that stuff, also hyperlinks to your documents. So as you're taking notes, you can have clippings, you can have links to other sources. So you kind of have this sort of hyperactive notebook. When we deployed it publicly, people would often just send me kind of examples like, hey, look what I did with this tool. So I just wanted to show a few examples of those. Like this one was a professor who was, I think he taught English, and he had a bunch of novels he wanted his students to read. So he pulled together off of Amazon just links to the, we had a web search feature built in too, so you could search for it, find the book, he'd clip the cover in here, so he could just kind of remind himself of what the students are covering. And then he's got jotted in various outlines and notes and what the assignments are going to be and so forth, a little clipping from the syllabus. So it's kind of this, this interesting hybrid of collected content, links to the web, clipping pieces of documents with notes arranged spatially on the page. And so we had great tools to support that kind of thing. This is another example where this person's a web designer, and they're basically taking their old web design and they're sort of clipping off key pieces of it, and then around and on top of that, they've sketched out what their idea for the new designs are. So it's basically like, I think there's like 3 different ways they're thinking of designing the the website, and they're sort of comparing and contrasting them. So again, just kind of using pieces of existing content and over-sketching on top of them is sort of an underserved workflow in the modern world. This is another example of, this person was involved in theater. So for some reason for his play, they needed an anime sock puppet that looked like a cow. And so he's searching on the web how to draw anime eyes. He's bringing up some examples. He found an example of a cow, and now he's practicing sketching anime eyes on top of his cow. So, but this is the kind of task that in traditional tablet PCs, this was incredibly painful, because to switch to the web browser, then you had to bring up the little keyboard and type in these things, instead of just being able to handwrite it and just do a quick search on that. This one's a writer. He liked black. It's a book of damn knowledge. There was this other, like we had one student who, like, whenever he hit a bug, he'd send us a little report that looked like this, with just thrown together with clip art. It was just fun. And of course, any new technology, there's geeks out there, and they must apply it to Dungeons and Dragons. So I wanted to switch and do a quick demo of this. Oops. Sorry. Here we go. So of course I can write in this thing. One of the things that we put in here was just some really simple controls that were optimized for pen. So there's kind of this, in the HCI literature, there's this, they're called marking menus. I usually just call them radial menus. We just have these little circular menus, and here I'm just hovering the pen over them to see what the options are. And then if I touch down and stroke with the pen, I can go and pick a particular color, for example, for my marker. So instead of having a linear pull-down menu, we just arrange things by direction, which just seems a very simple shift. But there's a couple important points here. One is that this feels really nice when you're using a pen. So instead of having to go and tap at things, you just kind of go and do these quick strokes. The other thing is that once you kind of know that, say, black is up and to the left and that red is down and to the left, that becomes something that you learn to do very quickly. So once I know that, I don't even have to look at the menu. I can just kind of go and do this rapid stroke, and I just get the tool. So it's you can basically be switching between different tools in just a fraction of a second, as opposed to navigating through these complicated menus. So we have a lot of touches like that in here, and we spend a lot of time I won't go into it in this talk, but there's getting the details of these menus right. If you want to do this kind of interface, you have to pay attention and sort of get everything right. So we spend a lot of time on just looking at what the core controls for pen should be. Another example is we put in these search features. So for example, here I can go and circle this. I use this talk for a keynote. I can circle this phrase. I can go down and say search, and then it'll recognize the handwritten text, and it's immediately just throwing that against my hard disk here. So this is kind of everything that's on this computer that has these keywords in it. And I can very quickly say, like, okay, maybe it was a Word document, so I can very quickly narrow down on that. And once I find one, I can actually drag a link to that to my canvas here. Or maybe it was a PowerPoint, right? So here's my dub talk from today. It's right in the index. So I can very quickly find content in my device just by doing that. And then of course, once I've got content like that, I can have a radial menu attached to these links. I can just open that, and once Word fires up, there's the abstract for my talk. So I can very quickly go from jotting something down to searching for it to finding it, and then of course I could even say, okay, well maybe I like this first paragraph. I can take a clipping of this, and then I can go back to my notes, and there it is, right? So I can come in, and now maybe I can mark this up. Oops. Right, so you can very quickly have this workflow where you're just jotting notes, you're finding your content, you bring it back into your notes to mark up or to have links back to the documents. We also have a feature built in where it automatically attaches a link to the document when you take one of these clippings. So we put a lot of work into these, and we got somewhere over 50,000 downloads of this. It was quite popular for a time. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work on most Windows 8 devices. It's kind of, it's not really an active project anymore, so don't recommend it on that platform. Okay, so enough of that. Okay, and this is the part where you get to see Morgan's fantastic acting skills in a second here. So another thing we've looked at to support some of these reading combined with writing behaviors is actually dual screen devices, which is, actually if you go, I mentioned Abigail Sellen's book on the myth of the paperless office early in the talk. She actually, this is a book written about 10 or 12 years ago now. She actually in that book mentions how, if you want to support these behaviors effectively, that's a very interesting class of device to look at, but nobody had really built one. So I was like, well, why don't I do that? Now I say nobody had built one, but if you go back to Vannevar Bush's classic MEMEX paper, which was published in the Atlantic in 1945, it's this very bizarre microfilm realization of it, but he basically had this vision where you could pull up documents, all the world's libraries are on microfilm. You can call up pages either from the same book or from different books, and then off to the side is a writing pad. So even back in 1945, this guy was a genius. He totally understood this activity that people were trying to do. The microfilm implementation maybe not so much so, but the world's come a long way. But still, even it's 60, 70 years later now, and we still don't really have an effective realization of this kind of system. But we're really close, I think, to be able to do these kind of things. Of course, when Andy Van Dam saw me give this talk, he sent me this slide. He's like, well, there's actually this medieval reading wheel in the 1500s or 1600s where you could have this giant wheel and you had books on it. And I think one of his PhD students actually prototyped this because he's been around forever. So I went ahead and built a dual screen display. And Morgan actually was involved with this project. This was the very first prototype. I literally just went to Fred Meyer and got some old paper notebooks, and I gutted them, and I stuck these little computers inside them. They were called the OQO Model 2 computers. They could run full Windows Vista on them. They weighed about 2 pounds each, and you could put them in this little folding case, and that was our prototype. They just talked to each other over wireless. And this is sort of the system we came up with. We did quite a bit of work in this system also, so there were actually some sensors in there so we could understand how it was folded and what you could sort of set it up like a teepee and play Battleship on it, those kind of things. So it was a really fun system. I have a couple of clips from this I want to show.
Let's look at how knowledge worker might use the codex for individual and collaborative sense-making tasks. Joe Researcher is interested in electronic notebooks, but he needs some inspiration.
Hey, Joe.
Morning, Morgan. Hey, what's that?
Check this out on Flickr. There's all these photos people post of their moleskin notebooks.
Neat, that's really cool. I definitely gotta check that out for an electronic notebook project.
Yeah, you can help me put together some cool stuff for our group presentation.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Back in his office, Joe uses his codex as an electronic scrapbook to follow up on the thought. He does a quick search and starts to explore what's there. Joe browses the photos side by side with his notes. Then he grabs a clipping, all without interrupting his primary note-taking task. Next, Joe decides to review a video that he's got queued up. He's got his codex paired with his desktop, so he grabs the video onto his notes. He just opens it up from the automatic hyperlink. He pulls out the screen so he can watch it in landscape. While he kicks back and jots a few notes. He just pops it back in when he's done, and he's back where he left off. After a couple days, Joe has a bunch of cool stuff. To help organize things, he makes a table of contents, and he pulls in links to all the important pages. Joe can press on a page link to see a preview, or open the link to navigate through the page. The pages show up on the other screen, so he doesn't lose track of the big picture. To make the most of the small screens, Joe puts some details into sidebars. He just lassos what he wants, shrinks it down, and makes it into a sidebar. When he taps on a sidebar, the details are called out on the other screen.
Okay, and then I got.
Let's look at how
oops. There's one more.
Now the day for the presentation has come. Joe flips his codex to the laptop posture and projects from the top screen. He can look at his speaking points and drive his presentation from the bottom screen. So here's what Morgan and I have been thinking about. Customization is a big deal in paper notebooks. Like this, or this one. It has to be very personal. Big bold fonts really stand out. And people really like to show you what's in their bag.
Why? That's dumb.
Yeah, I guess some people are just dumb. Overall, the two screens of the codex afford a separation of concerns in reading versus writing, public versus private, and other partitions of task rules and views. The facile transitions between usage contexts via sensed postures enable a rich set of possibilities without undue burden to the user.
Yeah, so if there's anyone from Hollywood here, I hear Morgan is available for acting gigs.
Now the day for the presentation is.
Yes. Okay, so and that was a really fun project. So yeah, unfortunately, the company that made those went bankrupt, so you can't buy them anymore. But they were, maybe might have something to do with the iPad, just maybe. So I want to show next another sort of shot across the bow here I wanted to take in terms of exploring e-reading specifically with pen and touch. Sort of the core observation is that this various forms of content in the digital world, whether they're emails, documents from coworkers, websites, magazine articles, ebooks, your own notes, these are the foundations for authoring new work artifacts. And Bill Buxton has a riff in this that I often like to steal, which is that he says, slate computers and e-readers represent a new class of digital appliance, one targeted for casual use. And with the growth of this market will emerge a new and long overdue approach to interaction, one that is in keeping with the casual intent and context of such usage, and which will complement rather than replace interfaces that support more formal and structured activities. So basically, this slate space it's a whole new game, and just trying to apply the traditional interface design approaches to it isn't going to fly. And so we tried to sort of take this to heart and look at this. If we were going to design an e-reader that had some of these active reading capabilities built in, well, what might that look like? So we came up with this video prototype. We actually implemented it. I have a video of this prototype. It was called Gather Reader.
We present an e-reader prototype for a pen and touch display tablet. It provides a reading experience for knowledge work that is tightly coupled with writing, including annotation, cross-reference notations, and facile collection of encountered information. Flipping through pages driven by touch is a core transaction for reading and browsing through documents. This has a low cognitive barrier, encourages scanning back over recent material, and keeps the user in the flow of the document, while the pen frees the user to quickly interleave annotations. The user can interact directly with the text by framing it at the margin. Within this highlighted frame, the pen offers the precision needed to select individual words and characters. The user can read content side by side with notes. The user swipes across the top bezel to reveal the toolbar, and then taps the split view icon. The user can flip the document pages independently of the note pages. Notations are automatically linked to the document page that accompanies them for easy cross-referencing. This is indicated by a glue cone that projects the notation to the source page. As soon as the user finishes writing a passage, the user can then later frame a notation to reveal the links back to its source. Tapping this link flips back to the relevant page of the document, and tapping it again brings the user right back to where he's currently working. Animated page flips help make the link traversal salient and unambiguous to the user. Notes about a different page are cross-referenced separately. This makes it extremely easy to work with disparate parts of a document in one working context. Likewise, tapping the comments button on the document page brings the user to any notations associated with that page. To facilitate lightweight aggregation and informal organization of information, the prototype features several ways to collect and counter content. The user can frame and tear off a piece of the page as a really quick and easy way to collect a specific passage. Dragging it to the center spine pockets it for later use. The pocket serves as a visual clipboard that offers a visually salient but unnamed and uncategorized place to temporarily put things, without breaking the primary workflow of reading and browsing through pages. The user can then pull the clipping out of the pocket at a distant location. The user can then pocket entire pages by initiating a page flip but then extending it deliberately to the center spine. This fluidly integrates a collection of pages with the act of navigating pages itself. Multiple items can be left in the pocket, to be dealt with sometime later. The user can take a mark and give it a post-hoc interpretation as a gesture by touching it. For example, here the user activates a lassoed clipping by touching it, then he pockets it. Touching it again turns the selected mark back into normal ink. Likewise, the user can tap on underlines to highlight specific words, or delete marks that have already been dealt with. The virtue of this approach is that the user can initially focus on reading while marking up the text, and then later fuse those marks with computation if desired. Collectively, these techniques use interleaved pen and touch interactions to support an active reading and writing experience that is geared towards creative work, rather than linear consumption of information. The techniques enable a virtuous cycle of browsing, collecting, and aggregating notations and pieces of encountered content to support the informal organization of information. We believe such tools and techniques can help bring about a more human way of working with digital documents and files.
And when was that work done?
I published this at CHI 2012.
And given all these kind of like
I mean, I think the key is the markup with the pen, of course, is, and
I mean, a lot of these ones seem oriented towards people having had it on pens.
right. But I mean, if you,
Handwritten or any of those things.
yeah, I mean, I think the other aspect is, like, even in the video I just showed, like, although the pen is sort of a key part that enables that workflow, there's quite a few of the gestures are just based on touch. So, like, all the collection gestures are designed to be done with touch. The reason there is we wanted to make it really easy to just be kicking back, reading something, and then be able to gather either the entire page or a piece of a page just with a single hand, even if you're not using the pen there. So I think just having better support for those kind of behaviors is kind of like the first order thing. There's another great system called Liquid Text, which Keith Edwards and Craig Tashman did at Georgia Tech. And that system does not have a pen, but it has some of the same kind of perspectives in it. It's a little bit more heavyweight, I would say, than what I just showed, but they have some great things in there for doing cross-referencing and comparing parts of documents. So there, it's clear you can do quite a bit of this kind of behavior with just touch there. But once you get into actually wanting to mark up the text and doing some more of those kind of things, I think trying to do that from touch is just it's really a non-starter. And on the iPad, the reason that's so hard is, like, you can buy these little capacitive styli for them, of course. The key on the iPad is that it can't tell that from a finger touch, so you cannot distinguish, you can't make the capacitive pen leave ink and your finger just drag. It doesn't know the difference between the two. So that's sort of a key technological challenge there. On this device I have here, for example, it actually does know, like, this is the pen, and if I touch with my finger, it knows that's my finger. So you can, in your UI design, you can actually make those do different things. And I think that's a good path to follow if you actually want to get the most out of the two modalities. So does that answer your question? So again, the purpose of the design was to support these kind of lightweight gathering activities without bouncing you out of your focus on reading of just information that you might be encountering during those tasks, and without interrupting the flow of the reading. This is also critical. If actually gathering and collecting these things, if it takes so much attention or time that it distracts you from the reading activity itself, people won't do it in the first place. So having really low overhead techniques to support these things is critical. And we achieve this by trying to minimize these transaction costs, the actual cost of going and grabbing the functionality whenever possible. So for example, this was the motivation for our feature where you could start turning the page, but then if you just kept dragging, you could drop it in the middle of the page, and that would essentially bookmark that page. So we just tried to sort of piggyback on that page flipping behavior itself, and just a simple little, very subtle extension that's fast to do, we can get more out of it. And again, having the stylus differentiated from touch, as I was just emphasizing, is critical to having this style of workflow, having it work well. So I wanted to do a sort of brief side trip here on looking at multiple devices as well. Of course, in Microsoft, we have to call these windows, and it's very serious, but it can be a lot of fun too. So if I just take a picture of my desk on a random day, it might look something like this, where there's all these papers that I'm reading or reviewing, kind of these stacks of things. And to you, this just looks like a mess. But to me, I know, like, okay, here's my stuff on active reading, and here's the stuff I need for that paper. And even just the different orientations of these things is like, this is one group of papers, this is another group. So I'm kind of using this structuring information to actually encode things in my daily work. So that's interesting. And then, of course, I research in this space, so I tend to collect a lot of these e-readers and devices. But just one day it struck me, I have this little unassuming briefcase. I didn't actually bring it with me today, but it's pretty small. And then I started unpacking it because I was looking for something. And on my desk, I ended up, I had like this, like, well, wait a minute, what happened there? I have 7 computers in my bag. Like, when did this happen? And several of them were just different flavors of Kindles. I had a Kindle Fire, I had the iPad, I had my little MP3 player, I had my camera. And that's not even counting my phone, which is in my pocket. So I'm walking around with 8 computers, right? And I don't know, for someone who came up in grad school in like 1990, this is like, wow, this is amazing. But more and more, like, this was actually one of on the little ad-supported Kindle, this is one of the screens that came up, really emphasized that people already are doing these reading tasks across multiple devices. So in a sense, this reality is already here, even though, maybe I'm kind of way out in the curve in terms of number of devices that I typically have with me. Other people are getting there rapidly as well. I also noticed that I started doing things like where I would read one certain book on one device and a different book on another one. So even with devices that are ostensibly identical, they started taking on distinct roles. And then I would leave them stacked. Kind of started looking like the the paper. So you wonder how far you can push that. Of course, my friend Bill Buxton again, he's got this gigantic collection of devices. I'm not quite going to get to his stage, I don't think, ever. Yes, he does have 4 wristwatches on, and if you have 20 minutes, he'll give you a rant on that at some point. But there's been this huge, and actually most of the devices I have here are like kind of examples from the past that have failed for one reason or another, mostly because they're ahead of their time. But there's tremendous opportunity still for innovation here. So I wanted to, this is not my work, but it's work done by Nicholas Shen, he was a PhD student of Francois Gumbritier at University of Maryland and also at Cornell. And he's actually now a postdoc at MSR Cambridge, Microsoft Research Cambridge. And he's been sort of looking into a system where there's multiple of these. They're kind of like Kindle DX devices, but he built them custom himself, and they have full pen markup. And he's been exploring this question of what happens when you have lots of these just sitting on your desk. So I'm going to show this video of Nick talking about this system.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Chen, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a prototype reading device that I'm building. This is work done in conjunction with the University of Maryland, Cornell University, and Microsoft Research in Cambridge. So basically, my research is in building electronic reading devices that better support the reading activities that occur in the classroom and the workplace. If we think about how people read in the classroom and workplace, it's quite different than what people do when they read for pleasure. So, for instance, if I'm reading Harry Potter, what I do is I read a page, I turn to the next page, I read a page, I turn to the next page. It's a very linear reading process. On the other hand, if I'm reading for work, I frequently read with multiple documents, and then sometimes I have to flip back and forth and navigate within each of these documents. So, for instance, there might be a picture on this page, and later on in the text, it might refer back that picture, so I have to flip back that picture and then return to where I left off. These types of reading activities are not very well supported in existing electronic reading devices like ebooks, or even in, say, the PDF reader on a laptop. The reason why paper seems to be so good at these types of activities is because each sheet of paper basically is a completely independent display. And because I have so many of these displays, it's very easy to spread out multiple paper documents in the workspace, or because I have so many displays, I can look at multiple things at the same time. The main focus of our research is to test whether an electronic reading system that has multiple screens can better support the reading activities we find in the workplace and in the classroom. To make such a system viable, we created a set of multi-slate reading interactions that take advantage of the fact that we have multiple screens, but also reduce the overhead of working across multiple devices. The first of these interactions is actually in the background. Whenever we make a mark or an annotation on a slate, it gets synced to all of the other slates as well as to a PC via Dropbox. This connection to Dropbox also makes it very easy for us to send a document on the PC to a slate. When I slide a slate up against another one, I get a 2-page view of the document. This is very useful, especially when we're reading a page, go to the next one, and we find ourselves turning back to reread. Well, with a 2-page view, we can quickly again glance back instead of having to turn the page. Earlier, I mentioned that when we're reading for work, we often have to move around quickly between different pages within a document. Our system makes this easy by presenting a global overview of all the pages in the document. We can quickly select the page and view it and jump around like that. But more powerfully is the fact that we can take an additional slate, open an overview on that one, and keep the detail view on this first one. And if we so choose, we can call up one of these pages on the slate that we're primarily using. We can extend this idea by opening up other overviews in the environment, and then this way we can quickly navigate between different documents. Another thing that we find people do when they read with paper is that they create piles as they read. And the reason they create piles is because it's very efficient to map a concept to a spatial location. For instance, I might have documents of topic A on my right here and documents of topic B on my left here. We support something similar with our system by treating each slate as an independent stack of documents. So if I have this document that I want to move to the left here, I can pick it up and drop it onto this stack right here, at which point it gets added to the stack. Now, if we take a look at the stack in more detail, we can view the documents in the stack, and then we can also save the stack. The ability to save the stack is really important because because one of the big concerns people have when they first see the system is that they're worried that they have to carry around a bunch of slates everywhere. In our vision of the future, we believe slates will become cheap enough that you'll have a couple in different locations that you read in. Therefore, when we move to different locations, we don't have to carry the slates with us. We can simply save the stat, and then when we get to the destination, we can restore it, and therefore, we can recreate our reading workspace without having to carry a bunch of slates around. The last thing I want to show is the tight linkage between the slates and the PC. So in addition to the connectivity provided by Dropbox, our interactions actually support the simultaneous use of the slate alongside the PC. And the reason we do this is because we realize that many work-related reading activities are in support of a task that somebody's doing on the PC, for example, writing an essay or writing a report. So the first of these is the fact that we have a shared clipboard between the slates and the PC. So what I can do is I can select some text, copy it, and then on the PC side, I can paste it into my word processor. Another feature that streamlines working between the PC and the slates is the fact that we can control the slates remotely from the PC. So right here, I can turn the pages on the slate from the PC and without having to interact with the slates directly. And this is really useful if I'm primarily working with the PC and I don't want to have to be bouncing between two different devices. And now, for whatever reason, I need to select text, for instance, or look at a photo in more detail, I can quickly call up any of the documents on my slates directly on my PC and view it in more detail that way.
Okay. So that was Nick Shen demonstrating his system there. And Nick is very soft-spoken and very humble, but it's a really neat system that he's put together, and there's a bunch of other things they explored as well. There's actually a great article they did for the Transactions on Chi journal that talks about this system. And one of the things he didn't mention in the video is he built like 40 or 50 of these things, and they deployed them to classrooms. And he did several iterations of this, so it's kind of a great lessons learned and exploration paper. So I would recommend you seek it out. It was actually nominated for it was like a notable paper of last year. So I'm kind of running out of time, so maybe this would be a good point just to open up to questions and discussion. I kind of showed most of the things I wanted to. So I'd be glad to just hear your reflections or thoughts on any of this.
So I just saw this thing that Adobe has coming out where it's like a pen and also a ruler. And then I was watching this and I was thinking about just the role of hardware that you see versus how much this will be in software. So I'm kind of wondering, like, do you believe that we'll just have like a million devices that we're using and that we just leave them all around, or do you think we'll have some connection between?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting design tension that keeps coming back and forth. Is like, well, do you have more hardware like the 8 readers in my bag? Like clearly that's a bit extreme. But if there's repeatedly this pressure to integrate everything to one device, then you have this like giant PC, and then people break it apart again, and it seems to keep coming and going. And so I think the real answer is somewhere in the middle. Like even in Nick's system, like kind of as he suggested in the video, just having a whole bunch of slates all over the place isn't ideal. You need to have some way to have these stacks that you move back and forth. You can take one with you. The particular system that you mentioned, yes, I've seen the video. And so what Morgan's talking about is Adobe's releasing this hardware where there's some kind of custom stylus that they built for the iPad. I don't have the technical details on exactly how it works, so don't take my word on that. But it's a custom stylus that works with the iPad, and it also has this little ruler tool, which is I can use my phone as a proxy for it. So basically, you can take this pen from Adobe, write on your iPad with it, and it's also got a little pressure tip in it. So first off, when you write on the iPad, it can be pressure sensitive. The sensor in it, it's got a battery, and it sends the signal over Bluetooth to the iPad. But they get around this problem of not being able to distinguish pen from touch on the iPad by when the pen sees pressure, I think what it's doing is saying, okay, that contact is now the pen. And so now it can say, my finger can do one thing, the pen can do something else. So that's clever. They do a second thing, which is another piece of hardware, which is kind of like my phone, where you can drop this in the iPad. And I think it has a couple of conductive contacts on the bottom, so it's kind of like a 2-finger touch, but you have to hold the thing. And you can basically use that to set up straight lines, so you can kind of draw virtual lines there. And they did a very clever thing where there's a bunch of buttons on here to control modes. So with your left hand, I can say, okay, I'm drawing arcs, I'm drawing straight lines, I'm drawing different kinds of brushes. So you have a very rapid way to switch between a number of tools with your left hand and impose these virtual controls constraints. So, in terms of like the overall design, like I think it's spot on with like the principles that I've shown here. Like my main complaint would be, first off, that having these two tools and the kind of the screen real estate of an iPad is pushing it a little bit. And secondly, the actual pen quality itself is not that great, just because you need a thick tip and the iPad can only do so much with that. But it's a very clever system, so I'd encourage you to seek out the video if this interests you at all.
At what point does the slide the thing off the bevel stop working, right, bezel? And that there's too many options or whatever. For example, like you couldn't do that in Photoshop because there's like 50 different things you could possibly use.
Right, so this was the little trick that I had of pulling things in from the edge of the screen. I thought,
like Windows 8 now too, right?
yeah, which is, so yeah, obviously I originally came up with that idea before Windows 8 came out. So now like I'm kind of mad because they stole that design language, so I can't use that for these kind of things anymore. What we found is that in that particular interaction, like you can really only have a few of those. The way you can, there's a couple ways you can scale it. One is to have sort of just a default. When you drag through certain options, it'll just come through with that one. But if you just drag it out and then release and then touch down, now you can have a radial menu on that for multiple options. So you can have sort of one default, like the yellow post-it, and then maybe you could touch and stroke in different directions for other ones. So those wouldn't be as efficient, but it's kind of a way to scale it up. And you can also do things like, you could have like one finger versus two fingers is another way to scale it up some more, right? So you could have more options as well that way. But it was kind of like, we were really thinking it's like probably for like 5 to 7 or maybe 9 things. Like we weren't thinking like 100 commands would be supported that way.
Did you try doing it with like one hand controlling like the modality and the other one like actually drawing?
Yes, we've actually studied that. It was actually a study I did with James Landay and one of his students that we published a number of years ago. And it turns out that is probably the most efficient way to switch modes that is known to date.
Yeah, there was this recent Brett Victor video where he did that for like an hour, and I was just like,
yeah, it's remarkable.
Per minute is just ridiculous.
Yeah, and the reason it works so well is that you can sort of overlap the two things. So I can be touching something with one hand while I'm doing this. So you kind of get this pipelining going on. And people can, and because it doesn't require their attention, it's a little bit like using control keys on the keyboard in Photoshop and so forth. Like it's a skill that people can just get better and better and better at until you just fly. So essentially you can, like even in the study we did, it was kind of people who hadn't used this technique before. And by the end of the study, like I can't remember the exact number, but people were under 100 milliseconds for switching a mode, which is really fast for UIs. And I think with more skill, it can basically get down to almost 0 because you can fully overlap the actions. But yeah, this is a great paper we did in 2005 or so on that. Anything else? All right, thanks very much.